Ferdinand Magellan stayed aboard the Trinidad on the morning of April 27, 1521, and the Pacific Ocean became a Spanish lake. The longboats that should have carried him toward the reefs of Mactan never left their davits. The 49 men in half armor who, in another life, would have waded into chest-deep water under a hail of bamboo arrows instead remained at anchor, while a delegation of Cebuano nobles paddled toward the shore under Rajah Humabon's banner. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened, and why the real history unfolded differently. The fleet had departed San Lucar de Barrameda on September 20, 1519, 5 ships under royal commission from Charles I of Spain to find a westward passage to the Spice Islands. Trinidad, San Antonio, Concepcion, Victoria, and Santiago had wintered at Puerto San Julian, where Magellan crushed a mutiny and executed Gaspar de Quesada in the cold spring of 1520. The Santiago had broken up scouting the Patagonian coast. The San Antonio had deserted. 3 ships threaded the strait between October and November 1520, emerged into a vast and unfamiliar sea, and crossed it on starvation rations. They reached Guam on March 6, 1521, and the Philippine archipelago at Humabon 10 days later. By April 14th, Rajah Humabon of Cebu had accepted baptism as Carlos, and the Captain General had begun to mistake gratitude for obedience. Then came the dispute with Lapulapu. The chronicler Antonio Pigafetta and Magellan's Malay interpreter Enrique of Malacca both warned that the proposed punitive raid was reckless. The Mactan shoals would strand the longboats far from shore, and the warriors numbered well over 1,000. What no one in the fleet could yet see was that Magellan's choice between pride and prudence would, within 30 years, decide the fate of an ocean. Humabon's envoys returned from Mactan 3 days later with coconut oil, gold dust, and bundles of rice. Lapulapu had paid. He had not bowed, and Pigafetta noted in his journal that the Datu's eyes carried the patience of a man waiting for tide to turn, but the tribute was real, and the ceremony of submission was performed in front of Cebuano witnesses. Magellan accepted the settlement, took on water and provisions, and weighed anchor for the south. By early November, the Trinidad and Victoria reached Tidore, where Sultan Bayan Surullah welcomed the strangers with elephant horn fanfares and the offer of a clove monopoly. Antonio de Brito's Portuguese garrison at Ternate was still fortifying its position, unaware that a rival European fleet had arrived. Magellan moved quickly. He signed an exclusive compact with the Sultan, loaded both ships to their gunwales with cloves, and ordered a stockade raised on the bluff above the harbor with 20 Castilian arquebusiers and a small bronze falconet. The garrison flew the banner of Castile in plain sight of Ternate. When de Brito's pinnace arrived to investigate, the falconet fired a single warning shot across its bow. The Victoria, under Juan Sebastian Elcano, sailed west through the Indian Ocean and around the Cape of Good Hope. The Trinidad, hoping to recross the Pacific to New Spain, was beaten back by easterlies and limped at last into San Lucar in late October 1522, weeks behind her sister ship and missing half her crew to scurvy. Magellan came home aboard her. Charles V received him at Valladolid in a carefully staged ceremony, granted him the Order of Santiago and an annual pension of 2,000 ducats, and named him Adelantado of the Western Isles. Pigafetta's manuscript, copied for the imperial chancery within weeks of arrival, was no longer a curiosity. It was a strategic document. João III of Portugal had braced for war. The reports from de Brito reached Lisbon in the spring of 1523, and the Casa de India calculated that armed conflict in the Moluccas would cost more than the cloves were worth. Charles V calculated the same. The two crowns sent commissioners to Badajoz in 1524, and after 8 months of argument, they redrew the Pacific Anti-Meridian as a joint condominium rather than a contested line. Spain retained the Philippines and the northern Moluccas, including Tidore. Portugal kept Timor, the southern Moluccas, and the Banda Sea. Both crowns pledged mutual defense against any third power, Dutch, French, or Ottoman, that ventured east of the Cape. The 350,000 ducats that Charles had once considered accepting to abandon the Moluccas entirely were instead reinvested in shipyards at Cadiz and Acapulco. What no chronicler recorded at Badajoz, but what the next generation would discover, was that the treaty had quietly redefined the Pacific as Iberian water. Magellan returned to the archipelago in 1527 as governor, with Elcano as admiral of the joint Pacific Squadron. He bypassed Cebu, where Humabon had grown old and the Christian community quarreled with neighboring Datus, and chose instead the deep bay of Manila on the western coast of Luzon. The walled town rose stone by stone over the next decade. By 1538, the first regular Acapulco galleon, the San Lorenzo, anchored in Manila Bay, carrying Mexican silver to be exchanged for Chinese silk and Moluccan cloves. The route that real history would not open until 1565 under Legazpi was running 30 years earlier, and the silver flooded into Ming markets through Fujianese middlemen at a pace that began, almost imperceptibly, to alter the price of rice across southern China. The taxation that paid for Manila's walls fell hardest on the Visayas. Lapulapu had died of old age around 1535, but his grandsons remembered the tribute their grandfather had paid under duress, and they did not consider the bargain binding on a second generation. A coalition formed across Mindanao, joining the Maguindanao Sultanate and the Sulu Datus to the older Mactan resistance. In Ambon, a parallel revolt broke out against Portuguese clove monopolies. For 4 years, the joint Iberian fleet fought a grinding war of small landings, burned villages, and reprisals. The decisive engagement came at Iligan Bay in March 1541, where Elcano's son Martin, commanding a squadron of 16 vessels with shipboard artillery, broke the Allied Prahu fleet in a single afternoon. The cost on both sides was severe, and the consequences of that victory would prove harder to live with than anyone in Manila or Lisbon yet understood. In 1547, a joint reconnaissance fleet under Bernardo de la Torre, 6 caravels and 2 carracks, sailing from Tidore, charted the northern coast of an immense and apparently uninhabited landmass that stretched south beyond the limits of his charts. The Iberians named it Tierra de San Lorenzo. De la Torre planted a small Franciscan mission and trading post at the mouth of a great river debouching into what they called the Golfo de Carpentaria, and left a garrison of 40 soldiers and a chaplain to hold it through the wet season. The post survived. Within 5 years it was trading sandalwood and pearls northward to Tidore and Manila, and Iberian cartographers were beginning to suspect that San Lorenzo was not an island at all, but a continent. By 150, every major harbor from Cebu to Timor to the Carpentaria coast flew either the banner of Castile or the cross of the Order of Christ, and most flew both. Dutch and English captains who probed eastward in the following decades found Iberian patrols at every choke point and Iberian-supplied local rulers at every anchorage. The Treaty of Lisbon in 1554 formalized what had grown organically over 30 years, chartering the Casa de las Indias Orientales as a joint stock enterprise directed from both capitals, with shared profits, shared garrisons, and a single hydrographic office in Seville that maintained the master charts of the Pacific Basin. The ocean Magellan had crossed in starvation in 1521 had become, within a single human lifetime, the most tightly held maritime space on Earth. Whether the cost in indigenous lives, in Portuguese-Castilian rivalries deferred rather than resolved, and in the slow corrosion of 2 empires bound to defend each other in waters neither could fully control, was worth the cloves and the silver and the charts, that question the chroniclers of the Iberian Concord did not answer, and perhaps did not think to ask.